Now that the background of our koi fish painting has had a chance to dry with the wet on wet technique, we're going to actually be using wet on dry technique today. So our paper is the dry part. We are not going to be adding water straight to it like we did last time. We're only going to be adding water to the paints themselves and then painting directly on the dry paper. That's why this is called wet on dry, because you're using wet paint on dry paper. Now this is pretty easy. All we're going to do is load up our brush just a little bit, we don't need much, and go over the colors that you already used right on those splashes that we drew. So I'm going to be very careful to use the tip of my brush, and I'm going to go on that little splash that I already created, and it's going to look just like that. That's all I'm doing to it. I'm going to also go over those little water droplets that were coming out of the water. Now my next section is done in green though, so I need to rinse my brush. You don't need much water today, so you can kind of wipe it off. Just enough to get your paints wet a little. And I'm going to keep repeating this step using wet paint on dry paper and bringing out these details. And that's what it looks like after you use the wet on dry technique to bring out some of the splashes in the water with the cool colors. We're going to be focusing more on warm colors to use on the koi fish, which would be orange, red, and yellow. Here are some examples of koi fish, and if you look, most of the colors are the warm colors, oranges and red and yellow. They do have spots of white and even some black on them. Choosing the color that you want, remember to load the brush by getting it wet and swirling it around. And now I have some wet paint that I'm going to put on dry paper. Since the koi fish I'm painting was kind of spotted, I am going to leave some white spots in there where I don't paint anything at all. While my paint is still wet in those areas, I'm going to rinse my brush. I want to do a little bit of blending with the other warm colors, so I'm going to load up some of that red paint on my brush, and again painting on the dry paper. By putting this right next to that orange I just put down, it's going to do a little bit of shading and color blending for me, because the water is going to kind of attract itself to one another, and now I have a nice little red shadow underneath that fin. So when you're painting with your watercolors today, try to paint little sections at a time and allow those colors to blend together. You can use that paper towel to dry your brush off a little. We don't need a lot of water this week, just enough to keep our paints wet since we're using the wet on dry technique. And that's what your watercolor painting looks like after you have painted the koi fish using warm colors, red, orange, and yellow. If there was any black that you wanted to add, at this point, check with me first. I want to make sure that your painting is dry enough. If it's not, we'll let it dry and add the black details to it next week. If it's dry enough today, we can do that, but again, adding black is the very last thing that you would do, and I'm choosing not to add any to mine. For cleanup, take your painting paper and all and go put it on the drying rack, starting at the bottom row and working your way up. You can dump your water cup and rinse it in the sink. Just lay your cup next to the sink and then put your clean brush in the paint cup next to the sink. You can leave your watercolors at your table for my assistant to collect. And if you have a paper towel at your table and it's a little wet, you can use it to wash up any paint that you got on the table, wad it up and throw it in your table trash can.